The prairie wind carried a sharp bite that evening, whistling across the wide-open land where dust rose in swirls and the sky glowed red from the dying sun. Out here, life had a way of testing every ounce of a person's will. The land was both cruel and beautiful, a place where love and hardship tangled together like wild vines. In the distance, the faint creak of a wagon wheel echoed, steady but strained, a reminder that nothing came easy on this rugged soil. Men and women alike had to learn to push harder, to fight against storms, hunger, loneliness, and the weight of untold secrets. It was in such a place that two souls crossed paths, bound not just by circumstance, but by something far stronger, something neither of them was ready to admit out loud. He was a drifter by look, though his hands told a different story. Scarred knuckles, broad shoulders, and a steady gaze revealed a man who had fought more battles than he could count, both with others and within himself. His boots carried dust from towns scattered across the frontier, but his heart carried burdens heavier than any saddlebag. Folks whispered about him whenever he rode into a new town. Some called him dangerous, others said he was cursed, and a few swore he was the only man alive who could stand toe-to-toe with trouble and walk away without flinching. Yet when the shadows stretched long and the fire burned low, he was not made of stone. Behind the teasing grin and the iron will was a man haunted by choices and driven by a hunger for something he had yet to name. She, on the other hand, belonged to the land as if it had shaped her from the earth itself. Strong, graceful, and unyielding, she knew how to guide horses through raging storms and how to stare down men twice her size when they tried to question her place. But even the strongest spirits carry soft places hidden from the world. Her laughter was rare but bright, like a sudden burst of lightning on a summer night, and her eyes carried both defiance and longing, the kind that dared anyone to truly see her for who she was. She had lived through loss that could break most hearts, and yet here she stood, working the soil, tending to the stock, and keeping alive the dream her family had once carried across miles of wild country. The first time their paths crossed, neither had expected much from the other. He rode into town under the weight of silence, and she stood there, measuring him with a kind of look that could strip a man of his pride. Their words were sharp at first, two guarded spirits clashing as if the world itself had set them against each other. Yet beneath that surface, something restless stirred. In the way his teasing words lingered longer than they should, and in the way her breath caught when his voice lowered, there was a tension neither dared to name. Life on the frontier left little room for dreams, yet dreams were exactly what kept folks moving forward. Fires burned not just in the hearth, but in hearts, hidden beneath layers of grit and stubbornness. Theirs was not a simple story of chance meetings or quiet evenings. It was the kind of story where every moment pressed them closer to a truth that could not stay buried forever. He carried himself with the swagger of a man who could tease danger itself and walk away grinning, but when his gaze met hers, there was something unsteady, something raw, as though he too was waiting for a storm he could not control. She was no stranger to storms either. Nights on the plains had taught her that even the fiercest winds eventually settled, but people were harder to tame. She swore to herself she would not be led astray, not again. Yet every time his voice teased, every time he dared her spirit with words that made her heart pound, she felt the old walls begin to tremble. He called her angel with a crooked grin, and though she tried to scoff, the name lingered in her chest longer than she cared to admit. The land itself seemed to conspire against them, drawing them together in ways neither planned. When cattle broke free, it was his hands that steadied the ropes beside hers. When an unexpected storm rolled in, it was his presence that steadied her fear. The teasing never stopped, but beneath it, something deeper was forming, something neither one of them had the courage to put into words. The fire in her eyes met the fire in his, and though neither spoke it aloud, both knew they were standing on the edge of something that could burn brighter than any midnight flame. Yet old wounds have a way of creeping back into the present, For him, it came in the shape of men riding hard into town, carrying the weight of vengeance and unfinished business. For her, it came in the form of whispers, the kind that reminded her of all she had lost and how dangerous it was to let anyone too close. The night stretched long, filled with silence and glances that spoke more than words. She told herself she should walk away, should turn her back before the fire grew too hot. But then he would smile, not the kind of smile meant for the world, but the kind meant only for her, and she felt her strength bend in ways she did not expect. Every heartbeat felt heavier, every glance between them sharper, like a blade pressed too close. She knew what folks would say, what the town would whisper if they saw the way he leaned closer, teasing words falling off his lips like sparks. She knew what her own heart would risk if she allowed him past the defenses she had built brick by brick. And yet, in that fragile space between defiance and surrender, she found herself unable to pull away. The prairie was wide, the nights long, and the fire crackled with a hunger neither could deny. She swore under her breath that she would not give in, and he swore just as fiercely that he would never push beyond what she allowed. Yet their story was not one of simple promises. It was a story shaped by tension, laughter, sorrow, and the kind of longing that refused to be buried. The night the fire burned low, he leaned closer, his voice low enough that only she could hear. His words teased, daring her spirit, daring her strength, and she answered with a look that told him she was not easily broken. The air between them thickened, not with fear, but with something neither of them could name. The sound of the wind outside pressed against the walls, rattling the windows as if the whole world held its breath, waiting for what would come next. She whispered, her voice steady but filled with a challenge that made his blood run hot. He grinned, slow and deliberate, his eyes never leaving hers. The firelight danced across their faces, throwing shadows that stretched like restless spirits against the walls. For a moment, time itself seemed to freeze, holding them in a fragile balance, daring either one of them to make the first move. And just as the silence grew unbearable, a sharp sound echoed from outside, breaking the moment like glass shattering in the night. Both their heads turned, eyes narrowing, the tension shifting from unspoken longing to sudden danger. The fire snapped, sparks flying high, as the unknown stepped closer. Neither of them spoke, but both knew this was only the beginning of a story that would demand everything they had to give. The sound outside grew louder, carried by the prairie wind until it felt like the very earth was humming beneath their feet. The woman's hand instinctively tightened on the edge of the table, her eyes darting toward the door as if expecting it to burst open at any second. He didn't move right away, but his gaze sharpened, and his body shifted with the calm readiness of a man who had lived through too many nights like this. The teasing fire in his eyes was gone, replaced by a dangerous focus, as if every muscle in him was coiled and waiting. The horse's nervous whinny outside made it clear this wasn't just the wind. Something or someone had come close, moving with purpose. He rose slowly, boots pressing against the worn wooden floor, the sound heavy in the tense silence. She followed him with her gaze, torn between the urge to ask what he planned and the instinct to keep her voice low. He reached for the rifle propped against the wall, his hand steady as though it had been waiting for this moment. "Stay behind me," he said, his voice a low command. She wanted to argue, to remind him she wasn't some fragile flower to be hidden away, but the intensity in his tone left no room for debate. Instead, she crossed the room quietly, her heart pounding hard enough she swore he could hear it. The crackle of the fire seemed louder now, filling the space with restless noise as the door rattled softly in its frame. The night outside was dark, the kind of darkness that seemed alive, where shadows moved just out of sight. He stepped closer to the window, careful not to draw attention, and parted the curtain just enough to see. For a long moment he didn't move, his jaw tight, his grip firm on the rifle. She waited, every second stretching until it felt like an hour. Finally, He spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. Riders. 3 of them. Too quiet to be friendly. The words hung in the air, heavy as stone. She felt a chill crawl down her spine. Out here, men didn't ride in silence unless they carried dark intent. He moved back from the window, his face shadowed by the glow of the firelight. The teasing grin she'd seen earlier was gone, replaced by the hardened mask of a man who knew what it meant to survive on the edge. She stepped closer, her voice firm though her chest tightened with unease. Do you know them? His eyes flicked to hers, then back to the door. Not yet, but I've seen the kind before. They ride looking for something. Or someone. The way he said it made her stomach twist. There was something he wasn't telling her, something buried in his past that had now ridden straight into their night. She wanted to ask, wanted to demand the truth, but the thunder of hooves outside told the question from her lips. The horses slowed, their heavy steps crunching against the dry earth. Then silence. No greeting. No call to announce themselves, just stillness. He raised the rifle, his body angled to shield her without a second thought. She felt her breath catch in her throat, torn between fear of the men outside and the mystery of the man standing so protectively in front of her. Minutes passed, or maybe just seconds. The night offered no answers. Then came the faint creak of a saddle, followed by a low voice carried on the wind. She couldn't make out the words, but he stiffened, as if every syllable struck something deep within him. His jaw tightened, his hand flexing around the rifle. She dared to whisper, "What did he say?" His eyes stayed fixed on the door, his voice low and grim. He called my name. It was then she realized just how little she truly knew about him. He had ridden into town like a stranger, teasing and bold, hiding his scars behind a grin. But this was a piece of him she had never seen, a piece tied to men who rode under darkness and silence. Whatever his past was, it had finally caught up. The knock never came. The riders didn't force their way in. Instead, the sound of horses pulling away broke the tension, fading into the distance as quickly as it had arrived. He didn't lower the rifle until the night was quiet again, and even then his body stayed tense, his ears straining for the faintest trace of their return. Finally, he let out a slow breath, setting the weapon against the wall once more. She watched him closely, her own breath unsteady, waiting for him to explain. But he said nothing. His silence carried more weight than words. She felt her frustration rise, her fear battling with anger at being left in the dark. "You knew them," she said, her voice sharper than she intended. "Or they knew you. Which is it?" He finally looked at her, the hardness in his gaze softening just enough for her to see the shadow of regret behind it. "They knew me. And that means they'll be back." The fire popped, sending sparks dancing into the air, the only sound filling the silence between them. She wanted to press him, to demand answers, but something in his tone warned her he wasn't ready to speak of it. Not yet. Instead, she turned away, her mind racing. Life on the frontier was hard enough without ghosts from a man's past riding straight to her doorstep. Yet she couldn't ignore the way he had shielded her, the way he had placed himself between danger and her without hesitation. That act alone stirred something deep inside, something she didn't want to name but couldn't shake. He moved to the door, bolting it with a steady hand, then crossed the room to the fire. His shadow stretched tall against the wall, larger than life, yet somehow carrying a loneliness that pressed heavy on her chest. She saw the way his shoulders sagged just slightly, as though the weight he carried was far greater than any of the townsfolk could guess. She sat down, her hands folded in her lap, her voice quieter now. "If they come back, what then?" His eyes flickered with something fierce, something unyielding. "Then we push harder. We don't bend. That's the only way to survive out here." The words settled into the room, strong yet laced with unspoken truth. It was more than just survival he spoke of. It was about every choice he had made, every fight he had walked away from, every wall she had built around her heart. Out here, the only way forward was to push harder, even when the world seemed set on breaking you. She studied him for a long moment, the mystery of him deeper now than it had been before. He was a man of secrets, of shadows that refused to stay buried. Yet he was also the man who stood between her and the night, who dared to tease her spirit, who carried both fire and burden in equal measure. The night dragged on, each hour filled with unspoken questions and restless silence. Outside, the prairie wind howled like a warning. Inside, the fire burned low, and two souls sat side by side, both knowing the story was only beginning. The danger had not passed. The mystery had not lifted, and the tension between them grew heavier with every heartbeat, pressing them toward a storm neither could avoid. When the final log cracked and fell, he stood, his shadow long across the floor. His eyes met hers, steady, unflinching, carrying both promise and warning. She felt the pull of his presence, the fire of his words earlier still echoing in her chest. But before she could speak, before she could ask the questions that burned inside her, a distant gunshot split the night. It was far, but close enough to remind them both that the past wasn't done chasing, and the fire between them wasn't the only thing threatening to consume their world. The gunshot hung in the air long after its echo faded into the night. She stood frozen, her breath caught halfway, while he tightened his jaw and moved toward the window. The rifle was in his hand before she had even registered that he had picked it up. His movements were too smooth, too practiced, and in that moment she realized that danger was no stranger to him. He leaned into the window frame, eyes scanning the black horizon that stretched endlessly across the plains. The prairie was quiet again, too quiet. No horses galloping, no shouts, not even the restless chirp of crickets. It was the kind of silence that unsettled the bones, the kind that meant something was waiting just beyond reach. She took a step closer, whispering, "Do you think it was them?" He didn't answer right away. His hand tightened on the rifle, and for a moment she thought he might ignore her completely. Finally, his voice came low and steady. It wasn't a warning shot. Someone meant business. That sent a chill through her blood. Out here, a gunshot in the dark was more than noise. It was a message. She looked at him, at the way his shoulders squared, the hard line of his mouth, the storm burning behind his eyes. He wasn't just some wandering drifter. He carried history, heavy and sharp, and now it had ridden straight into their lives. The fire popped behind them, but neither turned. He stayed at the window as though the night might reveal its secrets if he only stared hard enough. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to steady her breath. Questions pressed at her lips, but she knew he wasn't ready to give answers. Not yet, and maybe she wasn't ready to hear them. Morning came too slow, painting the sky with gray light that bled across the horizon. He hadn't slept. She had heard his boots shift against the floor all through the night, the sound of a man too restless to trust the quiet. When the sun finally rose, he stood by the door, watching the land as though it might swallow him whole. She made coffee, her hand steady though her stomach was knotted. When she set the tin cup in front of him, he gave a small nod, but his eyes never left the horizon. She sat across from him, her gaze steady. "You can't keep silent forever. I need to know what we're up against." His fingers tightened on the cup, the steam curling between them. For a long moment, he didn't speak. Then finally, his voice came out rough. "Those men out there, they're not strangers. I rode with some of them once. Before I came here. Before I thought I could leave it all behind." Her chest tightened. She hadn't expected him to confess so openly, but the weight in his voice told her he was tired of running. "What kind of men are they?" she asked softly. He lifted his gaze, and the shadow in his eyes made her regret the question. "The kind who take what they want. The kind who don't stop until the ground itself has swallowed their enemies." She felt her pulse quicken, but she forced herself to hold his gaze. And what did you do to make them ride after you? His mouth twitched, not quite a smile, not quite regret. I left, walked away when they wanted me to stay. Some men don't forgive that, especially men who think loyalty means blood. The words carried a weight she could barely grasp, and yet she understood enough. He wasn't hunted for land or cattle. He was hunted because he had chosen a different path, and in their world, betrayal, real or imagined, was met with steel and fire. The day passed heavy, the air thick with what wasn't said. She tended to the stock, her hands busy with chores, but her mind never strayed far from the man pacing the edges of her land. She watched him sometimes, the way he scanned the tree line, the way his hand brushed near his hip as if expecting trouble at any moment. He was a storm waiting to break, but he was also the only shield she had against the danger circling closer. Later, when the sun dipped low, she found herself standing near him as he tightened the fence post. The air between them buzzed with unspoken tension. She wanted to tell him to leave, to take the danger with him, but the thought of him walking away left her feeling hollow. Instead, she said, "If they come, I won't hide. This is my land, my fight too." He turned sharply, his eyes burning into hers. "You don't understand. If they come, they won't care about land. They'll use whatever they can to break me, and that means you." Her breath caught, but she didn't step back. "Then let them try. I won't be broken." For a moment he studied her, his jaw tight, his chest rising and falling like he was holding back words he didn't trust himself to say. Then, with a slow shake of his head, he muttered, "You're fire, angel. Fire that doesn't know how bright it burns." The words sent a shiver through her, but before she could respond, the distant echo of hooves reached their ears. Both froze, the weight of the sound dragging the air taut around them. He set down the tools and grabbed the rifle in one smooth motion. Her hand brushed the pistol strapped to her hip, a weapon she hadn't touched in months but now felt like the only lifeline between life and death. They moved toward the house in silence, each step heavy with anticipation. The sun had nearly vanished, casting the land in shadow. The riders appeared at the far edge of the field, silhouettes against the fading light. 3 of them, just as he had said. Their movements were slow, deliberate, like wolves circling prey they had no intention of letting go. She felt her chest tighten as they drew closer, but she kept her chin high. Beside her, he stood like stone, his rifle steady, his presence unyielding. When the riders finally stopped at the gate, the man in front leaned forward in his saddle, his face hidden beneath the brim of his hat. "Well now," the rider called, his voice low and smooth, but with an edge that made her skin crawl. "Ain't this a fine surprise? Thought you'd run farther than this." Her companion didn't flinch. His voice was steady, cold. "You should have kept riding." "Nothing for you here." The rider chuckled, a sound that carried no humor. "There's always something, and you know why we're here. You left business undone. Men like us don't forget." A silence stretched, heavy and sharp. She could feel the danger pressing closer, not just from the riders, but from the storm of secrets standing beside her. She wanted to ask what they meant, what business was left undone, but her voice stayed locked in her throat. The rider leaned back, his smile a shadow in the fading light. "We'll be back when the moon's high. Maybe then you'll be ready to face what you owe." With a sharp tug on his reins, he turned his horse, and the others followed, their silhouettes fading once more into the darkness. She exhaled only when they were gone, but the tension didn't lift. He lowered the rifle slowly, his face grim. She stepped closer, her voice quiet but firm. "What do they want from you?" His eyes met hers, and though his mouth stayed silent, she saw the truth written there. Whatever it wasn't simple. It wasn't safe, and it wasn't done. That night, the fire burned low again, the shadows deepening around them. She lay awake, listening to the restless wind, to the sound of his boots pacing across the floor, to the heavy silence filled with words he still refused to say. The conflict wasn't just outside, It was inside these walls, between secrets and trust, between fear and the fragile fire that sparked every time their eyes met. The riders would return. The land would not forgive weakness. And between them, something stronger than fear, but just as dangerous, was building, pressing against the walls they both had built, threatening to break free before either was ready to face it. The night stretched long, heavy with waiting. The silence between them was no longer the quiet of strangers, but the charged stillness of two people bracing for a storm they both knew was coming. She sat near the fire, her hands restless in her lap, her eyes catching the glow that flickered against the walls. He paced the room, his boots sounding against the wooden floor, each step slow and deliberate. Every time the wind rattled the shutters, both of them looked toward the door, their bodies tensed as if the riders would appear at any moment. She wanted to believe the men had only been bluffing, that their threat to return under moonlight was just meant to rattle nerves, but deep down she knew better. Men who spoke with voices that cold didn't waste words. They would be back, and when they came, it would not be with talk. It would be with fire, steel, and whatever vengeance they had carried for years. He finally stopped pacing, his hand gripping the back of a chair, his shoulders rigid. She studied him, her voice breaking the silence at last. "You said they'll come for what you owe. What is it you left behind?" His eyes flickered toward her, and for a moment she thought he would finally spill the truth. But instead he looked away, his jaw tightening. "It doesn't matter what they want. What matters is they won't stop until I make them." "That's not an answer," she pressed, her frustration mixing with fear. "If I'm caught in this, I deserve to know what's riding toward us." His gaze snapped back to hers, sharp and unyielding. "You don't deserve their darkness." "That's mine to carry." She held his stare, her chest tightening. "It's already at my gate." "That makes it mine too." The words hung between them, raw and undeniable. For a heartbeat, neither spoke. The fire cracked loudly, as though the land itself was listening. He finally turned away, but not before she caught the flicker of something in his eyes, not just regret, but fear. Not fear of the riders. Fear of what his truth might do to her. When the clock struck midnight, the sound of hooves rolled through the air once more, steady and deliberate. Her heart jumped, her breath catching in her throat. He lifted the rifle without hesitation, his whole body shifting into readiness. She rose too, her hand brushing the pistol strapped at her side. Together they stood in the dim glow of the fire, waiting for whatever would come. The hooves grew louder, closer, until the earth itself seemed to tremble. Then silence. The riders had stopped just beyond the gate. This time, their voices carried clearer through the night. "You've had time to think," the same low voice called, laced with mockery. "But thinking won't change what's owed." She glanced at him, her pulse hammering. His face was hard as stone, his jaw set, his rifle steady. He didn't answer. The rider's laugh cut through the night. "Hiding behind walls? Not like you. Or has the angel at your side softened you?" The words struck her like a slap. Her eyes widened, her breath hitching. They knew about her. They had been watching, studying, waiting for the right moment to twist the knife. Her gaze darted toward him, and though his face never flinched, she saw the truth flash there. He had known this was possible. They weren't just after him. They would use her as bait to break him. He stepped forward, his voice calm but edged like steel. "Leave her out of this. Whatever's between us, it's mine alone." The rider's reply came with a cruel laugh. "That's not how it works. You walk away from men like us, you don't just owe blood, you owe everyone who thinks they can stand with you. You brought her into this." The air felt heavy, the world holding its breath. She gripped her pistol tighter, the weight of it unfamiliar but steady in her hand. Fear twisted in her chest, but so did defiance. If they thought she would crumble, they were wrong. The riders didn't push through the gate, not yet. Instead, one called out, "Tomorrow night at the canyon." You come alone, or we come here, and the angel burns with you." Then the sound of hooves thundered away, fading into the distance once more. The silence that followed was worse than the noise, heavy and suffocating. He lowered the rifle slowly, his shoulders slumping just slightly, though his jaw stayed clenched. She turned to him, her voice shaking. "They mean it. If you don't go, they'll come for me." He set the rifle against the wall, his hands dragging down his face, his breath ragged. "That's why I can't let them near you. That's why I never should have stayed." Her anger flared, cutting through the fear. "Don't you dare talk like that. You think you can ride off and leave me to face them alone? You're a fool if you believe I'd let that happen." He stared at her, his expression torn between rage and something far more vulnerable. "You don't understand the kind of men they are. The canyon will be a trap. If I go, I may not come back." She stepped closer, her voice steady now, her eyes burning into his. "Then we plan for it. You're not walking into this alone, and you're not leaving me behind." For the first time, his resolve cracked. He reached for her arm, his grip tight, his eyes locked on hers. "If I lose you, I'll lose myself. Don't you see? That's what they want." Her heart pounded, but she didn't look away. "Then don't give them the satisfaction. We face them together, no matter what it costs." The firelight flickered between them, shadows dancing across their faces. The silence pressed heavy, filled with everything neither dared to say. Finally, he released her arm, his jaw tight, his voice low. "If we do this, there's no turning back." She didn't hesitate. There never was. The next day passed in a blur of preparation. He sharpened his blades, checked his rifle, and tightened the saddle on his horse. She gathered supplies, her hands steady even as her stomach twisted. Every moment was a reminder that the night ahead could be their last, but neither of them spoke it aloud. When evening fell, the town whispered of riders seen near the edge of the canyon. No one dared interfere, no one wanted to be caught in a war that wasn't theirs. But the whispers reached her ears, and each one drove home the truth: this fight was bigger than the two of them. It was about survival, about standing against men who thought fear could rule the land. As the sun sank, they rode out together, the horizon painted in streaks of red and gold that faded into deep shadow. The prairie stretched wide around them, the air sharp with the scent of dust and sage. She rode beside him, her pistol at her side, her heart beating like a drum. He kept glancing toward her, as though committing her face to memory, as though bracing for the possibility that he might not see it again. When they reached the canyon, the world grew quiet, too quiet. The wind stilled, the birds had fled, and only the faint sound of water trickling through stone filled the air. Shadows stretched long across the rocks, and in those shadows, danger waited. He dismounted slowly, his rifle steady in his hand. She followed, her boots crunching against the gravel, her breath sharp in her chest. The canyon walls loomed high around them, closing in like the jaws of a trap. And then, from the darkness, figures emerged. The riders had come, their silhouettes tall and unyielding, their eyes gleaming beneath the brims of their hats. The leader stepped forward, his grin a slash of cruelty across his face. "You came," he said, his voice low and mocking. "Brought the angel, too. That makes this sweeter." The canyon filled with the scrape of steel, the cock of guns, the sound of men ready to spill blood. She felt her chest tighten, her hand gripping her pistol until her knuckles ached. Beside her, he stood tall, his rifle raised, his presence like a shield. The leader's grin widened, his voice cutting through the night. "Let's see if you can push harder than the fire that's about to swallow you whole." The words echoed across the stone walls, mingling with the sound of boots shifting and weapons drawn. The moment before chaos stretched long and unbearable, every heartbeat thundering louder than the silence itself. The fight was about to begin, and the outcome would change everything. The fire still crackled low in the distance. fading embers glowing against the midnight horizon as the night slowly gave way to dawn. The storm that had gathered so much weight over the town, over the people, and over their own hearts was finally breaking. The air no longer carried the same sharp sting of dread. Instead, it felt lighter, though heavy with exhaustion, as if everyone had given a piece of themselves to survive what had come. He stood with his hand still wrapped around hers, firm and protective, and she leaned into him as though she had been waiting her entire life for that one safe place. They had both been pulled through shadows darker than the coal mines and tighter than any rope. Trust had been tested, pride had been stripped, and the truth of who they were had been laid bare. There was no mask left to wear, no hiding behind silence or distance. It had been proven in the way he had fought not only against those who threatened her, but also against the part of himself that had always feared closeness. She had seen him in his rawest form, a man whose strength came not from how hard he pushed against others, but from how deeply he cared when the world demanded he harden. The town, too, was different now. Streets that once echoed with suspicion now felt hushed with a kind of relief. Folks had gathered by the old church steps, speaking in quieter tones, their eyes softer. The ones who had turned away from him before now nodded with respect as he passed. Some even offered small smiles, the kind reserved for someone who had carried a burden heavier than his share, but never let it break him. The lines of division, though not erased, had thinned, replaced with the fragile beginnings of understanding. For her, the weight she carried was just as real. The whispers, the judgments, the way people had looked at her as though she belonged nowhere, all of that had tried to keep her small. But now she walked differently, her shoulders straighter, her gaze steady. She had faced the fire of their disapproval and had not only endured, but had come out standing beside a man who refused to let her fall. Together they had rewritten what others thought was fixed, proving that love, when built on truth and loyalty, could outlast the hardest storms. In the quiet that followed, their story did not suddenly become easy. There were still fences to mend, both with others and within themselves. He knew the land would still test him with its droughts and floods. She knew the people would not all change overnight, but the strength they had found in one another was not a fleeting spark. It was steady, like the glow of the lantern in his cabin that never went out even on the darkest nights. It was the kind of bond that could guide them through every trial yet to come. There was something almost poetic in how the land mirrored their journey. The hills, still scarred from the storm, carried a quiet beauty, the kind only visible when the light returned after darkness. The fields, though bent and battered, still held seeds beneath the soil, waiting for their chance to rise again. That was how they saw themselves now, not as victims of the fire, but as people who had planted something unshakable in its ashes. When he looked at her, he no longer saw only the woman who had been marked by her past. He saw his equal, his partner, someone who had walked into danger without hesitation because she believed in him. And when she looked at him, she no longer saw the restless man who tried to outrun his own shadows. She saw someone who had finally stopped running, who had chosen to stay, to fight, to love with a fierceness that refused to fade. The memory of that night, when her voice had trembled with both fear and courage, would remain with him forever. It was not the sound of weakness, but of resilience, of a heart that beat louder than the silence that once tried to smother it. His words, the ones he had spoken in the heat of the moment, were not just promises made under pressure. They were vows, carved deeper than stone, that he would never let her face this world alone. As the first rays of dawn stretched across the sky, painting the horizon with fire softer than the one they had survived, they knew this was not the end, but a new beginning. The roads ahead would still twist, the nights would still test them, but they were no longer two separate souls wandering lost. They were bound together, stronger for the trials they had endured. And that strength would carry them into every tomorrow. The townsfolk, too, would remember. They would remember the way he stood when others backed away. They would remember the way she held her ground when whispers tried to cut her down. Slowly, stories would shift. Tales told over supper would no longer paint them as outcasts, but as examples of what it meant to fight for something greater than yourself. And maybe, just maybe, those who listened would find the courage to do the same in their own quiet battles. By the time the sun fully broke the horizon, warming the earth with its glow, he finally allowed himself a breath he had been holding for too long. She pressed closer to him, her voice soft, almost like the wind brushing the wheat fields. It carried no fear, no hesitation, only certainty. What mattered now was not what had been lost, but what had been found. And in that moment, standing together at the edge of everything they had endured, they both knew the fire had not destroyed them. It had forged them. Their story ended not with the silence of defeat, but with the promise of life yet to come. The storm, the fire, the trials had all been chapters that tested the limits of their strength and the depth of their hearts. But in the end, the lesson was simple. Love, when it is true, is not fragile. It does not break when the world turns against it. It bends, it burns, it battles, but it survives. And in surviving, it becomes something even stronger. So when the day began and the sound of life returned to the land, their steps forward were not hesitant but sure. They carried with them the scars of the past and the courage of the present, ready to face the future. And though the fire was gone, its memory lived in their hearts, not as something to fear, but as a reminder of what they had overcome together. The story of that night would be told for years to come, whispered on porches and carried through generations. It would not be remembered for the danger alone, but for the way two souls, against all odds, stood unshaken. That was their legacy, carved not in stone or wood, but in the lives they touched and the love they refused to surrender. And so, as the last trace of smoke faded into the sky, they walked on, together, always forward, never back, knowing the fire inside them burned brighter than any midnight flame the world could ever throw their way.